welcome back to Food Prep Guide. I am out in the garden, sitting right in front of my garlic patch here, and I was noticing how yellow it was getting, which is what it's supposed to do when it's almost time to harvest. And it hit me that we are only about 2 weeks away from harvesting that garlic, and it's only May. It's going to be harvested around the first week of June, and that is plenty of time to get growing on some more things. And it got me to thinking about what I'm going to follow up my garlic with, and then my train of thought just kept going, and I started thinking about all sorts of the what to plant after what type options that we have in the garden. And I thought that would make a good video for y'all to give you some ideas and inspiration for what to plant after things that you pull early. Or not just pull early, but that you pull your spring crops and you have plenty of time, depending on what zone that you live in, if you have plenty of time to go ahead and plant another summer crop behind it. We can take advantage of companion planting. We can take advantage of crop rotation practices that help build the soil. We can take advantage of planting things that help deter other pests nearby. There are just all sorts of options. So I have 5 plants in particular that I'm going to be pulling in my garden either soon, within the next couple of weeks, or at the end of the season, and then we'll be doing some fall crops. So I have 5 specific examples, even though there are countless others, of some really good pairings of plants that do well following after another plant. Okay, let's get started. If you would like help planting a productive garden, scroll down to the description box of this video and click this link for a free garden printable. We calculated quantities for a year's supply of the most common garden vegetables and organized them into a neat chart to help you plan. We'll send it straight to your inbox. If you're new here, we invite you to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming tutorials on gardening and food preservation, food storage, and more. So I mentioned that this garlic is going to be pulled pretty soon. Now I have special considerations with what to follow up after pulling this garlic, and that is because I grow garlic in the same place year after year. Now some people will say you can't do that, or you shouldn't do that, I guess I should say, but I haven't had an issue with it. I used to have, this is the first year that this garlic is in this raised bed, but I used to grow it in ground, and I did it in the same place every year because I didn't really have my garden has grown over the years, and it started out, pretty small, and I just grew garlic in that one spot because I didn't really have a whole lot of other options. I have more options now, but I'm still choosing to plant it in the same spot, and I have never had issues with that. The only caveat to that is that you have to fertilize and put in your amendments before planting. That way you're feeding the soil. You're not just taking. You're putting some nutrients back into the soil with some good compost and some good amendments. We have a video on how to plant garlic and what kind of amendments you want to put there right at the beginning of when you plant, so I will link that to video in the description box below. But since I do plant in the same spot year after year, that's a special consideration because the garlic gets pulled around June and it needs to go back into the ground end of August, early September, so we really only have early June to early September to grow something else before the garlic has to go back in. So we need a very fast growing crop, and since it's June to September, those are really hot months here for us in the South, so it needs to be a heat loving crop too. And number 3, in particular, I would really like to add nitrogen back into the soil since garlic is our heavy nitrogen feeders. So what fits the mold for all 3 of those things, and that is beans. It can be green beans, it can be yellow wax beans, it can be dry shelling beans, the type of beans that you want to grow to shell and dry later. Those are the types of things that are going to put nitrogen into the soil, that grow really fast, that I can pull in, and they can be done in early September, and that are that grow really fast, and that grow in the heat of summer. They love that heat. So that's just a fantastic option for following up garlic. Now, if you happen to grow garlic in an area that doesn't get really hot temperatures, you're going to, of course, want to look into different other options. Another option, if you happen to be in a cooler type of zone, is lettuce. Lettuce does really good following up after garlic, and it doesn't steal a ton of nutrients that garlic needs when it's time to put it back into the ground. Okay, let's move over to our onions and talk about the next rotation idea. Onions are another crop that typically get pulled in early summer. They're sown in the spring. Every now and then, some zones will sow in the fall and then they will harvest in the spring. Here in zone 7B, 8A, we plant in very early spring and they are ready to get pulled out in very early summer. These are probably going to be pulled in about 2 weeks, which will be the 1st to 2nd week of June, right around the time that the garlic is pulled, kind of harvested around the same time period. So once again, we have an opportunity to get something else in the ground in its place. Now, you have a ton of options when it comes to following up onions. The only thing that you want to avoid is another rooting crop. So you wouldn't want to put carrots or potatoes or sweet potatoes or something, or beets. You wouldn't want to put that in the same spot as your onions immediately, at least. You certainly can in future seasons, but I'm just saying immediately after pulling the onions, because onions pull phosphorus from the soil, they pull nitrogen from the soil, and those rooting crops all really need phosphorus to form well. And since the soil is going to be somewhat depleted of phosphorus by the time that these get pulled out. Now you can remedy that by feeding very heavily with phosphorus at the time that you plant, if you were forced to plant another root crop. Now when I say forced, I just mean in your garden you have a smaller footprint and you really don't have any other options and you really want those carrots, then you can just amend pretty heavily with phosphorus. But at the same time, we also have to think about temperatures. Now I know we are located all across the country, all across the world, and it's going to be different. But typically when you harvest your onions, it's just now getting to the point where the really hot temperatures are coming in. And even if you live in a temperate climate, it's still going to be those really warm temperatures around the time the onions get harvested. And that's not a good time to plant carrots because they are cool loving. So in general, you just want to avoid those root crops because the other root crops are cool loving too. Beets, those are cool loving. So we want to stick with something that is heat loving because that's just the time frame that we're going to be in after onions get harvested. So a really great options for planting after onions is your winter squash, your pumpkins, and cantaloupe. So winter squash, even though it's called winter, it doesn't actually grow in the winter. It grows in this heat, it loves the heat of the summer. It's just called winter squash because it stores well all winter long. I made that mistake earlier on in my gardening career and planted them in the fall thinking they were actually winter and they weren't. But cantaloupe does really well as well because they love hot temperatures, and it takes them a while to get going, but once they do get going, they grow fast. Not as fast as something like your green beans, but you can absolutely get them in the ground in June and be able to pull them before your first frost for the most part. Always look up your first frost in the fall, and then count backwards from there. So let's say that your cantaloupe matures in 85 days and your first frost date is October 10th. You would need to count back 85 days from October 10th to make sure that you have enough time to get that in the ground. Since we are all located in different zones, that's going to be the safest way to decide what to plant after something. Just go to your first frost date in the fall and work backwards according to what your seed packet says is the days to maturity for the specific thing that you are wanting to plant. I'm going to be probably planting some pumpkins here this year. We have never dedicated space in our garden to a pumpkin patch because they sprawl and they take up so much space. But I'm going to be planting cantaloupe right over here, and I have from this space all the way to where this trellis ends is about 7 feet, and I feel like that's wide enough to put in a row of pumpkins. Now I'm not going to put in near as many holes and near as many pumpkins as what I have holes here. This is over 200 onions, 200 holes here, so certainly not going to do that many, but since they sprawl out really good, it would also be a good way to get some ground cover and cover up the existing holes so that I'm not having a ton of weeds come up through those holes, which is going to cause me problems later when I go up to pull up the weed fabric later on in the winter and amend the soil for next spring. So I think that's going to be what I'm going to do this year. So pumpkins, winter squash, and cantaloupe are good ways to follow up onions. Okay, let's move over to our cabbage and talk about what to follow up cabbage with. Cabbage is yet again another cool loving crop that is typically planted in the spring and harvested in early summer or even late spring in some areas, depending on how fast growing your particular cabbage variety is. For me, this is going to be pulled right around the same time as the onions, so we're only about 2 weeks away from harvest, maybe closer to a month. It depends. I'm going to I'm gonna look at how the heads are forming, and I'm gonna make a decision about my high temperatures, and I'll have to make a decision then. I would really like them to go another month to really get a good size head on them, but I don't know if my temperatures are gonna allow me to do that. I do have shade cloth on standby to throw them over in case those temperatures just get incredibly too high, but I learned recently that during the heading stage of the cabbage, they really kind of need that sunlight to really mature to the best of their ability. So I don't know if I should shade it and sacrifice the size of the head, or not shade it and not. I don't know. I don't know what I'm gonna do. I have a big decision to make. But anyway, I'm rambling. After cabbage, it's just like we were talking about with the onions. We have a hot season ahead of us, and something that absolutely loves hot weather is okra. I have planted okra as late as July and gotten an excellent harvest by September, so they are also a pretty fast growing crop as well. They love the heat, can't even handle a slight bit of chill at night in general. And okra is a fantastic thing to follow up cabbage. Now, in general, like if you were to do a Google search, you would probably find not to plant okra after cabbage because they are both heavy nitrogen feeders. When we are talking about crop rotation, we are wanting to hopefully follow up a crop that has different nutrient requirements than the crop before it. Now, in farming, that is extremely important because there are hundreds and hundreds of acres, and there is almost no way to properly feed that soil with enough time to get the second round of crop in the ground. Now, in our home backyard gardens, we have a little bit more wiggle room to feed and nourish and add nutrients back into the soil to support the growth of the next crop without depleting our soil too much. So it's not as, crop rotation is far more important for farming than it is necessarily for backyard gardening. Now, I'm just going to know in my mind, when I pull this cabbage, I know that I'm going to be planting okra here, and I know that this cabbage has been pulling nitrogen from the soil. My okra really needs nitrogen, so I'm going to come through and I'm going to add a very nice, healthy dose of nitrogen to this row before adding my okra. Okay, let's move on to the next crop. Okay, I tried to get a full view of the tomato trellis that we are under with close to 40 plants, but the sun is straight in my face, so we're gonna have to work with it. But we have the start of our tomato trellis here and extends that way and on the other side. But tomatoes, I want to talk about as a classic backyard garden staple. Almost anyone who gardens grows tomatoes. So what do we plant after tomatoes? Now, we have two considerations. One is if our focus is to rebuild our soil for next spring, then what we need to plant here is a nitrogen fixing crop, which means anything in the legume family, your sweet peas, your dry shelling beans, anything like that is going to put nitrogen back into the soil. But we have to be careful with what we pick because some legumes are heat loving and some legumes are cool loving crops, which brings me to point number 2, which is what if your goal is not necessarily to rebuild the soil at this point? What if it's to get a cool crop in after the heat loving tomatoes have died, temperatures are going down, and you want to get a winter garden growing, and you will take care of rebuilding the soil later in the spring before you plant your next row of summer crops. If that's the case, then I highly recommend growing Brussels sprouts after your tomatoes. The traditional crop rotation is going to say no because Brussels sprouts, again, feed on nitrogen, so do tomatoes. And you typically don't want to put those back to back. But like I said, we have more freedom in our backyard garden than typical techniques like farming techniques. We have the ability to specifically feed each crop what it needs. So even though all of these tomatoes are going to be depleting nitrogen from the soil, I can know that and go ahead and feed the soil with a heavy dose of nitrogen before planting my Brussels sprouts. The reason why I recommend planting Brussels sprouts in the same places as your tomatoes is for 2 reasons. Number 1, the tomatoes are heat-loving crops and they're going to be dying out around, well, it's going to be different depending on what area you're in, but in my area, they're going to be dying out last harvest around the 1st of September. End of August, the tomatoes are going to go kaput. So that is the perfect time frame to put Brussels sprouts in the ground. In my area, Brussels sprouts need to go into the ground around September. So the timing works out beautifully. But the second reason why I recommend Brussels sprouts after tomatoes is because Brussels sprouts get really tall, like surprisingly tall. They don't actually need staking. They don't need a trellis to climb. They're not a vining crop. They don't climb in that sense, but they can get very tall. And depending on how big those Brussels sprouts get, they can be kind of heavy. And if you live in an area with pretty heavy winds, it's pretty smart to go ahead and stake or support your Brussels sprouts in some way or another. Now, most of the time that you're growing tomatoes, you're going to have a trellis or a stake or a classic tomato cage. All of those are great options for supporting your Brussels sprouts. So that's one reason why I really enjoy following up my tomatoes with Brussels sprouts if you're trying to get the maximum amount of garden produce out of your existing garden footprint. If you, again, are wanting to not have a winter garden and you just want to condition your soil for the next season, go ahead and put you some sweet peas. There's a spider dropping from a web right like inches from my face. Okay, the wind's blowing it that way. Okay, sorry. So anyway, if you're wanting to condition your soil, go ahead and put sweet peas. Now, sweet peas are cool-loving crops. So like I said, there's cool-loving and heat-loving legumes, so you gotta be careful. But anything in your sweet pea family is going to be a cool-loving crop that can grow and thrive in the fall and even into the winter, and it will condition your soil for you and put nitrogen back into the soil, and you're ready to go again with your tomatoes next summer. Okay, let's move on to the next crop. Okay, this last crop rotation idea, or what to plant after what, is more of a category, and it's going to be all of your vining type crops. Now, most of our vining type crops are heat loving. Your green beans, the pole varieties of green beans, cucumbers, your poling varieties of squash. You have all sorts of different watermelons. You can trellis watermelons. You can trellis your pumpkins. You can trellis butternut squash and winter squash and spaghetti squash, and you just have a whole lot of options that are heat loving that really like to climb. So this has been the hardest thing for me to figure out in my garden in the past of what to plant here, because the cool loving crops, these are going to go, they're going to grow all summer. They're not going to be ready to get pulled out until August or September. Around September, it starts getting cool in my area. So all the heat loving crops are off the list. They're not an option. The problem is it's all the heat loving crops that vine, that pole, that need a trellis. Now, of course, we can plant things here that don't need a trellis. This would be a lovely place to put lettuces and beets and carrots and stuff like that. But since I have this structure here, I really want to utilize it if I can. I have two options that, depending on what your goals are for either conditioning your soil or getting a winter crop out of your existing trellises. So like I said, I have green beans, cucumbers, watermelons. I have a couple of tomatoes here, my zucchini rampicante, which is a vining variety of squash. If you have not heard of that variety of squash, I highly, highly recommend it, especially if you battle squash vine borers and want to grow up and not out. We have a video on the incredible 2-in-1 vegetable about that, and I will link it in the description box below. But all of those things are going to be coming out in August. So I have two options. Number one is going to be sweet peas. I mentioned that over there next to the tomatoes. But one reason why sweet peas is particularly well for trellis is because it is one of the only cold crops that vine. You can get pole sweet peas. The number thing that comes to mind is the tall telephone sweet peas from Baker Creek. I love them. They are beautiful. They get about 6 to 7 feet tall. They absolutely need some trellising, and they are prolific. Now, here's my caveat. I could, and I am still debating this, heavily debating it. I haven't made a decision yet. I could plant this entire 2 trellises. It would be about 50 feet each. So about 100 feet of, no, more than 100 feet, because I have 4 rows. 1, 2, 3, 4. 400 feet of sweet peas. And not only is it going to condition the soil, so sweet peas, they're in the legume family, so they fix nitrogen into the soil, which means it's going to keep nitrogen in your soil so that when you go to plant your cucumbers and your green beans and all of that next year, they're going to have that nitrogen available to them. And you won't have to necessarily amend as heavily the following spring when you're getting ready to put those plants in the ground. So not only are they conditioning, but they're an edible crop and they're a preservable crop. That's something that is really important to me when I am deciding on what to plant next. Is it still something I can preserve for use year round, or am I limited to only eating it fresh? Now, sweet peas, they obviously freeze beautifully and they can beautifully. The only problem is they are a lot of work. If you don't have a machine to shell peas, now it's different. It's one thing when you have one 5-gallon bucket that you can, the family can do while they're watching TV one evening after supper. But it's another thing when you have, what was it? What did we just calculate? Was it 200 feet? 50 feet times 4? 200 feet of of peas, both to harvest and to shell and then to preserve. And something that I found the one year that I did grow sweet peas in what I thought was a large quantity, it actually wasn't, because it takes so many peas to get a certain amount of pint jars. So I haven't decided yet, but if you absolutely love sweet peas and you want to grow them this year, go ahead and put them in the fall after you're done with your trellising and pole varieties of your summer crops. The second option, which is the one I'm leaning towards, is fava beans. Now, fava beans are in the legume family, so again, they're going to fix nitrogen into the soil. We're benefit from that. Number two, they are an overwintering crop for many zones. You can live in some pretty cold zones and still overwinter your fava beans. And what I mean by overwinter is I just mean it will survive the winter and put out a very early harvest in the spring. It's the very first harvest you'll get in the spring if you overwinter a crop. So that's the second benefit, is that it overwinters. But the third benefit is that it is a preservable crop. Fava beans are incredibly nutritious and they dry beautifully. So it's something that I can allow to plant in the fall. It'll grow really slow over the winter, and as soon as those spring temperatures start hitting like 55, 60 degrees in very early spring, which for us, those temperatures start hitting like late February, early March. I know it's totally different for people all across the country, but for us, that's when it happens. But whenever your temperatures start getting into that 55, 50, 55, 60, that's when the fava beans are going to put up all of their beans, and it's a pretty easy harvest in the spring. And you don't have to rush to harvest them like you do with your peas, because you can just allow them to dry and you can get to them whenever you can get to them and have your shelling beans for future use. So that's what I'm leaning towards, is loading up both of these trellises with fava beans after pulling everything and all of the summer crops. I'm thinking that's what I'm leaning towards. I think it's going to be a good idea. Okay, y'all, I think that is it. I hope that was helpful to you, and we will see you next time. Bye.